In a German hotel one night in 1968, Gene Vincent, once rock and roll's leather-clad prodigal son, leveled a pistol at a fellow performer and pulled the trigger. The shots missed their mark, sending a young English singer scrambling for his life. It was a shocking flash of violence, but for those who knew Gene, it was sadly in character. And the identity of that young singer would twist this story into something even stranger later on. A decade earlier, he had electrified the world with the rockabilly classic Bebopper Lula, his 1956 hit that helped define the rebellious spirit of early rock and roll. With his tortured voice, black leather attire, and a permanent limp that he had earned the hard way in a gruesome motorcycle crash, Gene personified both the thrill and the danger of rock's first wild era. This is the tumultuous story of Gene Vincent, a rockabilly force of nature who never, ever meant maybe. Welcome to Rock and Roll Mysteries. Gene Vincent was born Vincent Eugene Craddock on February 11th, 1935, in Norfolk, Virginia. He grew up in the American South, the only child of Ezekiah Jackson Craddock and Mary Louise Craddock. His father served in the Coast Guard during World War II, and the family moved around coastal Virginia, running a country store in rural Princess Anne County during Vincent's childhood. It was in those formative years that Gene soaked up the sounds that would shape him. The lonesome twang of country music, the gospel of local churches, and the earthy rhythm and blues coming over the radio. He even had a surprising soft spot for classical music. Beethoven's dramatic Egmont Overture was reportedly a personal favorite. In any case, Gene certainly showed an early affinity for music. At age 12, a friend gifted him a guitar, and the boy became inseparable from the instrument. He practiced country ballads and blues licks and taught himself by ear. Like many Southern teens of the era, he also heard the romantic call of the United States military. In 1952, at just 17, he lied about his age, with his parents' consent, and enlisted in the US Navy, looking for a life of adventure and a steady career. Gene served during the tail end of the Korean War, never seeing combat but working as a crewman on naval ships. By 1955, he was back in Norfolk with plans to re-enlist for a life at sea. However, the dangers of war would pale in comparison to the dangers of his own irresponsible and wild ways. On the 4th of July of that year, Gene used his Navy re-enlistment bonus to buy a brand new Triumph motorcycle. And that same holiday, he drunkenly crashed the bike on the streets of Norfolk and shattered his left leg. The accident was horrific. Doctors urged amputation, but the stubborn 20-year-old refused to lose his leg, and he told the doctors they'd better save it. Surgeons managed to piece him back together, but the limb was left mangled and held together with metal. Vincent would walk with a pronounced limp and endure chronic pain for the rest of his life, and he had to wear a steel brace from hip to ankle. In later years, a mystique grew around that injury. Some of Gene's promotional material falsely claimed he'd been wounded in combat in Korea, weaving a heroic war story around what was, in truth, a drunken driver's bad handlebar work. The reality was gritty. Months in a Navy hospital and a medical discharge ended his military career by late 1955. Gene returned to Virginia, a changed man, hobbled physically, but now entirely focused on music as his way forward. Back home in Norfolk, Gene jumped right into the local music scene to make ends meet. He could often be found haunting the country bars and dance halls, his guitar in tow, pretty much eager to sit in with any band that would have him. Despite his boyish face and polite southern manners, he had an intensity on stage that got a lot of attention. In these juke joints, Gene's eclectic influences fused into something new. He could whip up the crowd with a raunchy blues number, then dial it back to a gentle country croon. Friends recalled him as shy off stage, a pleasant young man, as they put it, in checkered shirts and jeans. But once the music started, a different Gene emerged. It wasn't long before the young musician assembled his own band. He dropped his surname, Craddock, and flipped his given names to create the snappier stage name, Gene Vincent. In early 1956, he formed Gene Vincent and his Blue Caps, a group named after the Blue Caps US sailors wear, which was of course a nod to his Navy roots. The Blue Caps would become legendary in their own right as one of the wildest rockabilly outfits of the 50s. The classic lineup included guitarist Cliff Gallup, whose blistering riffs later influenced countless rock guitarists, rhythm guitarist Willie Williams, upright bassist Jack Neal, and howling drummer Dickie Bebop Harrell. They were a rather rough and ready bunch of good old boys, but together they struck musical gold. Gene's big break came via a local radio DJ and promoter named Sheriff Tex Davis. In May 1956, Gene and the Blue Caps entered a talent contest in Norfolk, and they caught the ear of Sheriff Tex, who saw star potential in the limping kid with a big voice. Tex Davis became Gene's manager and hustled him into a small studio to cut a demo of a new song Gene had been working on. A song with a nonsense title and an irresistible beat. Titled Bebopper Lula, the track featured Vincent's wailing vocal, punctuated by ecstatic hiccups and Gallup's stinging guitar. The demo impressed Capitol Records, who offered Gene a recording contract. In a flash, the unknown sailor from Virginia was on his way to becoming a rock and roll star. In June 1956, Gene Vincent entered Nashville's storied Owen Bradley studio to officially record Bebopper Lula. What happened next is rock and roll lore. Capitol Records initially tucked the song on the B-side of Vincent's debut single, expecting the A-side, Woman Love, to be the hit. But DJs flipped the record and listeners went crazy for Bebopper Lula's slow, sexy groove. By that summer, the song was racing up the charts. It peaked at number 7 on Billboard, and it spent 20 weeks on the pop chart, selling over 2 million copies. Bebopper Lula was an instant classic. Rolling Stone would later rank it among the 500 greatest songs of all time. Many listeners who first heard it on the radio assumed it was the latest hit by Elvis Presley. Vincent's voice had a similar quivering sensuality, but it wasn't Elvis. It was a 21-year-old kid from Virginia, suddenly thrust into rock stardom. Away from the spotlight, Gene led a life as chaotic as his music was dynamic. He was married 4 times, and each union was short-lived and turbulent. In the summer of 1956, at the dawn of his fame, Gene impulsively married his first wife, a young woman named Ruth Ann Hand, only to divorce her within the same year. There's not a lot of information about Ruth, other than the fact she was 16 when they got married, and still 16 when they divorced. She passed away in 2008. But for Gene, it was no time to settle down into domestic life. He was skyrocketing. Gene's meteoric rise was helped by television and film appearances that captured his raw charisma. In late 1956, he and the Blue Caps were featured in the rock and roll film The Girl Can't Help It, starring Jane Mansfield. Jane was quite a character who had to deal with everything from lions mauling her son to the wicked world of Anton LaVey. If you're interested in her life, there's an early episode on the sister channel, Hollywood Mysteries, all about her. I'll put a link to the video in the description. And, while you're about it, please consider subscribing to this channel too. It's a new one, so all the support I can get in the beginning is invaluable. I'd love to make it to 10,000 subscribers, so thanks to all who've subbed so far. Let's get back to Jane and Gene. In The Girl Can't Help It, Gene performs Bebopper Lula in a rehearsal room scene. He wasn't the only one to make an appearance. Eddie Cochran, Little Richard, and Fats Domino were among the other legends to show up in this film, which pretty much enshrined the relationship between the new world of rock and roll and the movies. The exposure expanded his fan base on both sides of the Atlantic as teens in England and France went mad for Gene. He followed up in 1957 with a string of singles: Blue Jean Bop, Race with the Devil, Lotta Lovin', and Dance to the Bop. Though none of these matched the blockbuster status of Bebopper Lula, several made respectable chart showings. Blue Jean Bop hit number 16 in the UK, and Lotta Lovin' reached number 13 in the US, and, being something of a slow burner, went on to sell 1.5 million copies. Vincent and his Blue Caps were in high demand, and they toured frenetically. In November 1957, they even appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show, playing Dance to the Bop to a national TV audience. Night after night, Gene delivered wild high-energy performances that left audiences and bandmates awestruck. He would limp on stage and then unleash that voice, at times a feral rockabilly howl, at times a surprisingly tender croon. Gene's voice was great and much louder than the band, remembered British guitarist Joe Brown, who backed Gene on a 1959 UK tour. Brown marvelled at the crowds of teenage girls screaming at Vincent's every move. For many young fans, Vincent embodied a new kind of entertainer. Dangerously unhinged, yet vulnerably human. Music journalist Nick Kent later described him as that era's finest example of a complete lunatic let loose to entertain the masses, recalling a tale in which Gene, quote, beat up his wife, broke his leg, and fell off stage drunk in the middle of his opening song, all in the space of a single day. Hyperbole aside, such anecdotes speak to Vincent's reputation for unpredictability. He earned the mocking, but not entirely inaccurate, nickname, the Screaming End, implying he was the wildest cat on the scene. His second marriage, to Darlene Hicks in 1958, seemed for a moment to ground him. The couple settled in the San Fernando Valley in California, and Darlene gave birth to Gene's first and only child, a daughter named Melody, whom he adored. But domestic bliss was rather fleeting. Gene's heavy drinking and pill popping, which was mainly fueled by chronic pain and the pressures of the road, made him an erratic husband and father. By all accounts, he loved his family and tried to do right by them, one biographer wrote. But as was often the case, Gene's self-destructive streak caused problems. Booze and pills were as ever-present as milk and bread. He waved guns around. Sometimes, they went off. Darlene Hicks left him by 1961, taking baby Melody with her, after enduring his volatility, occasional violence and infidelity. By 1958, the initial white-hot blaze of Vincent's US fame had begun to cool. The Blue Caps were fracturing. The brilliant Cliff Gallup, exhausted by life on the road, left the band, and this removed a key ingredient of Vincent's sound. Sheriff Tex Davis, his manager, was also on the outs by the end of the 50s over financial disputes, which amounted to Gene accusing him of embezzling all of his earnings. As the charts grew tougher for rockabilly acts, Vincent struggled to score another big American hit. Nevertheless, he remained a hero overseas. Nowhere was Gene Vincent more loved than in Britain, where the first generation of UK rockers regarded him with almost missionary zeal. In some quarters of Britain, Gene was even bigger than Elvis. Not least among these groups were England's Teddy Boys, who were perhaps the first definable youth culture to emerge after World War II. Britain was still living through rationing in those years, and this included cloth. But teenagers in the early 50s were keen to rebel against the restrictions and began buying up discounted suits that were considered highly unfashionable and also vaguely immoral by ordinary people due to their large and extravagant cuts, which were based on old patterns from the Edwardian era. This is how the Teddy Boys earned their name. They paired these draped coats with bolo ties, Mr. B collar shirts, drainpipe trousers, and a pair of crepe-soled brothel creepers. And the look was, naturally, finished off with a heavily greased-up duck's ass. The Teddy Boys, and indeed girls, liked popping pills, causing mischief, dressing extravagantly, getting into fights, and more than anyone else, they were balmy about Gene Vincent. Even a decade after his peak, aging Ted showed up in force to greet their idol as he arrived at Heathrow Airport in 1969, and his cult would live on in rockabilly and Teddy Boy culture even after his death. 10 years before that, in December 1959, Gene took an offer to tour the UK, a decision that would reinvigorate his career and permanently burnish his legend. Gene Vincent arrived in London in 1959 to a hero's welcome from British rockers and Teds, who had been obsessed with him from the movies and his records. Waiting at the airport was TV producer Jack Good, the impresario of Britain's rock and roll TV show Boy Meets Girls, and who was a genuine rock enthusiast. To Good's surprise, the offstage Gene was soft-spoken and modestly dressed, hardly the Hellraiser image Good expected. But Jack Good had a vision. He was dismayed by Gene's nondescript attire of plaid shirt and jeans. He knew that the ultra-style-conscious British teens, especially the Teds, would not be so forgiving as their American counterparts when it comes to looking the part. So, Good famously refashioned him on the spot, swapping Gene's civvies for head-to-toe black leather and hanging a large silver medallion around his neck. It was pure theatrics. Good wanted Vincent to exude menace, and for him to be like a rock and roll Richard III, stalking the stage with a half-limp, half-swagger. In fact, noticing Gene's limp, Good even encouraged him to exaggerate it. As Vincent performed on Boy Meets Girls, Good stood in the wings hollering, "Limp, ya bugger, limp." The makeover was a brilliant success. British teenagers went absolutely mad for Vincent's brooding, leather-clad persona, the black leather rebel come to life. Backed by British pickup bands like Sounds Incorporated or the Wild Angels in later years, he delivered searing performances of his hits and new material. European teenagers loved the soft-spoken Virginian's dangerous, tortured, moody, crippled persona. One commentator, Scott Gronmark, wrote, "Perhaps because it was so close to the truth. Pills, booze, pain, bad luck, an obsession with guns, and a self-destructive streak a mile wide." Indeed, Gene's life in the early 60s was teetering between professional success and personal disaster. And both were on full display, and the first sour turn would come in Britain, where the dangers of the road would come back to haunt him once more. Tragedy struck in April 1960 during one of Gene's UK tours. He had teamed up with fellow American rocker Eddie Cochran for a series of shows across Britain, a marquee combination that drew packed houses. On the night of April 16, 1960, Gene and Eddie finished a gig in Bristol and headed to London by a taxi, along with songwriter Sharon Sheeley, who was Eddie's fiancée. In the early hours, their speeding cab lost control near Chippenham and crashed violently. Gene Vincent was thrown hard inside the vehicle, re-breaking his fragile leg, cracking several ribs and his collarbone. Sharon Sheeley broke her pelvis. Eddie Cochran, just 21 and at the peak of his fame, was hurled from the car and suffered catastrophic head injuries. He died in hospital the next day. The car accident that killed Cochran and injured Vincent sent shockwaves through the rock and roll world. Gene, racked with grief and pain, returned to the United States shortly after the crash, hobbling on crutches. His physical injuries eventually healed, as much as his battered leg ever could. But friends say Gene was never quite the same after losing his closest friend on that dark English road. The guilt and trauma compounded his already considerable troubles. Back in the States, in the early 1960s, Gene found an American music scene that had largely moved on from the rockabilly rebels of the 50s. Clean-cut teen idols and smooth crooners now dominated the charts, and it left pioneers like Gene struggling for relevance. He tried to adapt, experimenting with the rising folk rock sound and cutting a few country-tinged tracks, but the records failed to chart. By 1961, Capitol Records dropped him, and Gene bounced between smaller labels. Still, he had a loyal following in Europe and among die-hard rock and roll fans. He continued to tour the UK, where, quite frankly, we've always preferred stars to be more grubby than clean-cut, and he even ventured further abroad. A 1961 tour in France was a riot, quite literally, and it in turn cemented the French love for Le Rocker au Cuir Noir, or the rocker in black leather. Vincent's third wife, Margaret Russell, entered the picture in 1963. That marriage, too, was plagued by violence and jealousy. Friends recount that Jean could be sweet and soft-spoken one moment, then fly into a rage the next if fueled by a cocktail of painkillers and whiskey. In one infamous incident in 1963, during a tour, Jean threatened to shoot Margaret during a drunken argument. The police intervened, and Jean was dragged to Marylebone Magistrates' Court in London. Lucky for him, Margaret testified that she had forgiven him, and nothing more came of it. But it was the kind of episode that made even his backing musicians fear for everyone's safety when Jean was on a rampage. It's telling that Vincent's Keith Moon-level antics were spoken of in hushed tones by other rockers. He had a reputation for going further off the rails than almost anyone of his era. And yet there was almost a sense of fear at speaking out against Jean, who was often unrepentant. Margaret divorced him in 1965, citing abuse. Vincent's fourth and final marriage was to Jackie Frisco in 1966. She was formerly Jackie Twist and was a singer and sister-in-law of famous British producer Mickie Most. She performed with him on some tours, a glamorous rockabilly couple on the surface. But behind the scenes, their relationship was once again horrifyingly rocky and abusive. By the end of the decade, Jackie had effectively separated from Jean, though they never formally divorced before his death. Parallel to these tumultuous romances, Jean fought a never-ending battle with his health and addictions. The 1955 leg injury that had nearly cost him his limb continued to cause him excruciating pain every day of his life. He relied on a daily regimen of painkillers, often washed down with liquor, to get through tours. On stage, these substances sometimes enhanced Vincent's unhinged performances, but offstage, they unleashed his darker impulses. He developed an obsession with firearms, frequently carrying guns on tour. Band members recall Vincent drunkenly pulling out pistols in hotel rooms or backstage, sometimes firing into the ceiling for kicks. It was a dangerous habit that would culminate in serious incidents as the 1960s wore on. Money troubles hounded Vincent as well. Despite his early hits, Jean was notoriously bad at business. Much of his earnings had been siphoned by managers or spent in moments of excess. By the mid-60s, he owed back taxes. The IRS in America and the Inland Revenue in Britain were both on his case. Supporting multiple ex-wives and a child added yet more financial strain. At one point, British authorities even confiscated his passport briefly to make him pay tax arrears, stranding him in the UK until promoters intervened. These pressures only drove Jean deeper into a bottle. It was, even by then, a tale as old as time when it came to the breakout artists of rock and roll. Rock journalist Nick Kent mused about Vincent and his contemporaries. Were they on a mission to destroy themselves, or just plain unlucky? In Jane Vincent's case, it often seemed like both. He had genuine misfortunes, the disabling crash, the loss of Eddie Cochran, a variety of exploitative managers. But he also made choices that courted disaster. Whether out of bad luck or willful recklessness, Jane Vincent careened through the 1960s as a man slowly unraveling. By the late 1960s, Jane Vincent's career and personal life were both in freefall. The British invasion, a movement his own earlier style had helped inspire, swept American charts with bands like the Beatles and Rolling Stones, leaving little room for a rockabilly wild man of Vincent's vintage. This was ironic as John Lennon and George Harrison had both modelled their looks on Gene in their early days, and Lennon always spoke of his admiration for Gene, even as their stars headed in terminally opposing directions. Gene hadn't had a US hit in a decade. Challenge Records signed him in 1966, and Vincent recorded a handful of singles in a more contemporary rock style, backed by top-notch session players, including ex-members of the Champs and even Glenn Campbell on guitar. The music was solid. One single, Bird Doggin', showed he could adapt to a mid-60s beat, but none of these releases reignited his chart success. Even as the hits eluded him, Gene's notoriety only grew. In 1968, while on yet another European tour, his long-simmering volatility emerged once more. This time, it would prove fateful in an entirely different manner. The notorious incident unfolded in Germany. Vincent had befriended a young British musician named Paul Raven who was singing on the same bill. Paranoid and jealous, Gene became convinced Raven was flirting with his young girlfriend. In a drunken rage at their hotel, Vincent drew a handgun and fired several shots at Raven at close range. Raven miraculously escaped unharmed, and he fled the country in terror the next day before Gene could get hold of him. Of course, there is a dark irony in this story. A few years later, Raven would reinvent himself as glam rock star Gary Glitter. Glitter's disgrace for crimes against children made some suggest that Gene could have atoned for all his own misdemeanors by having hit his mark when he fired at Glitter. Perhaps unfortunately he missed, but the incident does seem to suggest Gene was an astute judge of character. Gene wasn't entirely bereft of supporters. In 1969, legendary British DJ John Peel, a longtime fan, offered Gene a chance at artistic redemption. Peel signed Vincent to his underground label Dandelion Records, hoping to introduce him to the new youth culture. That year, Gene recorded the album I'm Back and I'm Proud, produced by eccentric LA impresario Kim Fowley, and featuring guests like Jim Morrison's friend and Doors producer Paul A. Rothchild on hand. But even this comeback attempt was marked by drama. During one studio session, Gene, irritated by what he perceived as interference, suddenly threatened to fetch a gun from his car and shoot Rothchild and John Densmore, the Doors drummer, who were visiting the studio. The two men wisely scarpered, leaving Fowley and Gene to finish the track alone. This kind of erratic behavior made other musicians wary of working with Gene. Nonetheless, I'm Back and I'm Proud was released in 1969 to modest acclaim. Vincent's voice was noticeably weathered, but tracks like Sexy Ways showed he could still snarl and purr with the best of them. I'd say that if you've only ever really heard Bebopper Lula before now, this is a record that might surprise you and turn you onto the idea that there was a lot more to Gene than that one hit. He followed up with another album on Kama Sutra Records in 1970 and continued to gig where he could. By late 1971, however, Gene was a physical wreck. Years of hard living had ravaged his 36-year-old body. He suffered from bleeding ulcers, a condition surely exacerbated by his constant drinking, and his weakened organs were failing. In September 1971, determined to keep performing, Vincent flew once more to England for a scheduled tour. He managed a handful of shows, including some BBC radio sessions where he revisited Bebopper Lula and other classics one final time. But audiences could see he was in bad shape, pale, sweating, clutching his stomach in pain between songs. After just a few concerts, Gene cancelled the remaining dates and returned home to California, defeated at last by his ailments. A week later, on October 12th, 1971, Gene was visiting his father's house in Saugus, California, when he was suddenly struck down with intense stomach pains and collapsed. He was rushed to Intervalley Hospital in Newhall, but it was too late. Gene Vincent died that day at age 36, the victim of a ruptured stomach ulcer, massive internal hemorrhaging, and heart failure. The hard-driving life he had led finally exacted its price. He was buried in a humble grave at Eternal Valley Memorial Park in Newhall, California. His headstone reading in part, "Forever in our hearts, Vincent Eugene Craddock, Gene Vincent." News of Vincent's death sent his fans into mourning, especially in Britain and France, where he remained a cult hero. Ian Dury, the British rocker who idolized Vincent, was deeply moved. Dury later wrote that, as a teenager, he had wept upon hearing Bebopper Lula for the first time in the film The Girl Can't Help It, and he had collected every Gene Vincent record he could find. Dury later eulogized his fallen hero in the song Upminster Kid, name-checking him in the lyric. "When I was 15, I had a black crepe jacket and sideboards to my chin. I used to go around in a two-tone Zephyr with a mean and nasty grin. 12-inch bottoms on my Stardust flares and socks of dazzling green. Well, Gene Vincent Craddock remembered the love of an Upminster rock and roll team. In another song, Sweet Gene Vincent, Dury references the singer's sad Virginia whisper and asked, "Shall I mourn your decline with some Thunderbird wine and a black handkerchief?" This was a poetic nod to the ritual of a wino's funeral and Gene's own melancholy end. The world of rock and roll had lost one of its original rebels, but his legend was only beginning to grow. Though Gene Vincent did not live to see old age, his impact on rock and roll music far outlived him. He was among the first inductees into the Rockabilly Hall of Fame, honored as the inaugural member in 1997. The following year, he took his rightful place in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, where he was recognized as an early pioneer who contributed to shaping the genre. More meaningful than these formal honors is the influence Gene Vincent had on musicians who followed. Gene was, as one journalist wrote, an American rockabilly legend who defined the greasy-haired, leather-jacketed hot rods and babe spark of rock and roll. Indeed, the tropes of the rock rebel, the leather jacket, the delinquent allure, the unhinged stage energy, owe a great debt to Vincent's example. The young Beatles adopted his style in their early days, and you can hear echoes of Vincent's yearning ballad vocals in Paul McCartney's singing. And of course, John Lennon paid tribute to his hero when he covered Bebopper Lula in later solo sessions. Jim Morrison of The Doors was another disciple. He admired Vincent's uncompromising persona so much that he started wearing his famous leather pants as a look directly descended from Gene's 1959 wardrobe. Even in the punk era, Gene's shadow loomed. Johnny Rotten sported leather and sneers that were right out of the handbook of the original black leather rocker. On the other hand, the acerbic Robert Christgau once commented that Vincent was never a titan. His few moments of rockabilly greatness were hyped-up distillations of slavering lust from a sensitive little guy. But then, what more could a teenager in the 1950s have asked for than a hyped-up distillation of slavering lust? Sounds like Gene hit the nail on the head if you ask me. Gene remains the quintessential rockabilly rebel, an injured, imperfect man who gave voice to the wild desires of youth in a way few others have. Yet through all the wreckage, Gene made great records, and perhaps that is the simplest truth. When the needle drops on a Vincent track, whether it's the menacing opening of Race with a Devil or the plaintive croon of Important Words, the magic of rock and roll is palpable. It's the sound of pain, joy, and raw life force into 2.5 minutes of music. Gene Vincent's life may have been a wild and tragic ride, but his leather-clad rebel yell continues, loud and clear, into the 21st century. Hope you enjoyed that one. I certainly did. If you made it this far, why not give the video a like? I'll be back next week with another wild ride. In fact, next week's video is on a figure I mentioned in this one. Why not leave me a comment and have a guess at who it will be? Until then, I've been Chester. Have a good one.